Welcome to this journey into the dark history of the Ozark Woods, a place where beauty hides terror and where too many never returned. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is right now. We want to know in which corners of the world and in which hours of day or night these horrifying accounts are being heard. Make sure you subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the horrifying stories that history tried to bury. And if you want to support the work we do here, share this video with someone who thinks legends are just fairy tales. The Ozark Mountains, a stretch of dense wilderness where the trees grow so thick that even daylight struggles to pierce through. Locals call it beautiful, but in whispers they also call it cursed. In the year 1908, a series of strange events shook the small communities nestled along the Missouri-Arkansas border. Hunters vanished without a trace. Farmers stumbled upon mutilated livestock. And one young man's disappearance would ignite a story that has been passed down for generations. This is not folklore. This is not a campfire tale. This is the horrifying truth of why you should never go alone into the Ozark Woods. Stay with me as we unravel a nightmare that began more than a century ago and still lingers in the shadows of the mountains today. October of the year 1908 began like many other autumns in Newton County, Arkansas. The air was crisp. The trees along the ridges were painted in shades of amber and crimson, and the farms scattered across the valleys hummed with the usual routines of harvest and hunting. But for one family, the season would end not with celebration, but with a horror that would never be forgotten. Eli Johnson was only 20 years old. He had grown up among the rugged hills, the son of a farmer who taught him to plow fields by hand, to shoot straight, and to read the signs of the forest as if it were a second language. Eli was not careless. He was not reckless. He knew the Ozark Woods better than most men twice his age. That was why his family never hesitated when he announced one chilly morning that he would head out to hunt deer. He left just after sunrise. His mother packed him dried meat, corn cakes, and a small flask of water. Slung over his shoulder was his hunting rifle, its wooden stock worn smooth from years of use. Eli promised his parents he would return before sunset. His father, nodding with quiet pride, simply told him to keep his eyes open and his feet steady. Hours passed. The sun slid behind the heavy curtain of trees that blanketed the mountains. But as evening fell and lanterns began to glow in farmhouses across the valley, Eli did not return. At first, his family told themselves he had followed a deer trail too far. Perhaps he had chosen to camp for the night, though it was unlike him to do so without warning. But when the rooster crowed the next morning and Eli's bed remained empty, worry began to spread like fire. By midday, his father gathered neighbors into a search party. These were men hardened by the land, farmers, trappers, and hunters who knew the Ozark ridges as intimately as Eli did. They carried lanterns, dogs, and rifles, and they spread through the hills in wide arcs, calling Eli's name until their voices cracked. For 2 days, they searched. They found tracks leading down a narrow trail toward the deeper forest, prints that matched Eli's boots. The dogs followed the scent eagerly at first, but then something strange happened. The tracks simply stopped, not at a creek where water could have hidden them, not on rocky ground where prints might fade. They ended abruptly, as though Eli had been lifted from the earth. The dogs whined and circled, confused, refusing to go further. On the third day, a hunter stumbled upon Eli's rifle, leaning against a tree. The stock was cracked, though not shattered, as if it had been dropped with force. Nearby, tangled in a thorn bush, was a strip of red flannel torn from the shirt Eli had been wearing. There was no blood on it, no drag marks, just silence. Whispers spread quickly through the gathered searchers. Some muttered that a panther had taken him, others that Eli had been ambushed by outlaws. But as the hours stretched on and no other sign appeared, an older voice broke through the chatter. An old farmer, his face lined with decades of sun and toil, said quietly that the woods had taken him, that Eli had crossed a boundary that should never be crossed alone. By the time the search was called off, families in Newton County locked their doors tighter at night. Children were told to stay within sight of home. And a new warning took root in the community: never go alone into the Ozark Woods, for the forest remembers those who wander too deep, and it does not always give them back. The disappearance of Eli Johnson struck the small community like a hammer blow. In towns as close-knit as Newton County, every family knew the others, and news of tragedy traveled faster than the morning sun across the valley. When Eli failed to return that first night, there had still been hope. But by the second morning, hope had begun to sour into fear. His father, William Johnson, was not a man who allowed fear to take root. A veteran of the land and the Civil War before it, he was steady, practical, and deeply respected among the neighbors. On that morning, he strode into the center of the town square and called for volunteers. "My boy is out there," he told them, his voice carrying over the gathered men, "and I will not stop until I bring him home." Within hours, a party had formed. Farmers left their plows in the fields. Blacksmiths set down their tools. Even the preacher, Reverend Clark, rolled up his sleeves and joined the search. These were not men unused to hardship. They had braved floods, droughts, and wild predators. But the idea of one of their own simply vanishing into the woods unsettled them in a way no storm ever could. They armed themselves with rifles and lanterns, brought along hunting dogs to pick up Eli's trail, and marched toward the ridge where his boot prints had last been seen. The woods greeted them with silence. Not the soft quiet of birds and rustling leaves, but an oppressive stillness that seemed to press down on their shoulders. The men noted it, but said nothing. The dogs picked up Eli's scent quickly, noses pressed to the earth, tails stiff as they pulled the party deeper into the forest. For a mile or so, the trail was clear. Boot prints marked the soil, firm and even, as though Eli had walked with confidence. But then, just as on the first attempt, the tracks ended abruptly. The dogs whined and circled, scratching the ground as if confused. One of them, a hound named Jasper, let out a long, mournful howl that sent a shiver through the men. William knelt beside the last visible print, running his calloused fingers over the soil. "No rain, no flood, no reason these tracks should end," he muttered. His neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. A hunter suggested Eli may have climbed a tree, but the bark on the nearest trunks bore no sign of disturbance. Another proposed that Eli had doubled back, but careful inspection proved otherwise. The prints stopped, completely. For 2 days, the party searched in expanding circles. They waded creeks, combed ravines, and climbed ridges, calling Eli's name until their throats grew raw. At night, they returned to town exhausted but restless, sleeping only in brief snatches before dawn drove them back into the trees. The women of the community prepared food and prayed together, their voices trembling as they asked God for mercy. On the third morning, the party made its grim discovery. Propped against an oak tree, Eli's rifle stood abandoned. Its stock was cracked, but the barrel unbroken. 50 yards away, a torn piece of flannel clung to the jagged limb of a bush. It was the same shirt Eli had worn when he left his home. There was no blood on the cloth, no drag marks in the soil, no other evidence to suggest a fight. The men gathered around the rifle in silence. William lifted it, staring at the familiar weapon as though it might still carry his son's warmth. But it was cold, empty. "Something happened here," he said quietly. "But it leaves no sign." By dusk that day, whispers spread through town. Some spoke of panthers, others of outlaws, but an older woman named Abigail claimed it was the forest itself. She said the Ozarks held spirits older than memory, and that Eli had wandered where no living man should. Her words were dismissed publicly, but they lingered in the hearts of those who heard them. When the search party disbanded after a week of fruitless effort, a shadow hung over the community. Doors were barred earlier, prayers spoken louder, and children were warned not to stray too far from home. Though no one admitted it openly, the men who scoured the hills carried with them a quiet dread. It was not just that Eli Johnson was gone. It was the way he had vanished, without a trace, without reason, as though the forest itself had decided to keep him. By the time the search reached its third day, exhaustion had already settled into the bones of the men combing the Ozark ridges. Their boots were caked with mud, their throats raw from calling Eli's name into the silence. Every night, they returned with nothing but lantern soot on their faces and the heavy silence of failure. Families huddled in their homes waiting for word, but each morning the news was the same. No Eli, no sign, no answers. On that third morning, the searchers fanned out across a low valley where the trees stood close together, their branches knitting a canopy that choked off most of the daylight. The ground was damp and covered with thick undergrowth, the sort of place only the most experienced hunters dared to wander. It was here, in this suffocating stillness, that they stumbled upon the first real sign. Leaning against the trunk of a tall oak was Eli's rifle. The weapon looked strangely out of place, upright as if carefully positioned. The stock was cracked along one side, though not shattered, and the barrel was still clean. To the men who knew Eli, this was disturbing in itself. He would never abandon his rifle, not unless forced. William Johnson, Eli's father, approached slowly, his eyes fixed on the weapon. His hand trembled as he picked it up. It was undeniably his son's, the initials E.J., still carved faintly into the wood. He turned it over in his hands as the other men stood silent, each of them feeling the weight of what it meant. A hunter's rifle left behind was as good as a death sentence. Not far from the tree, one of the searchers spotted something caught in the thorns of a low bush. He reached for it and pulled free a strip of fabric. The men gathered close as he held it up. It was a torn piece of red flannel, ragged along the edges. William recognized it instantly as part of the shirt Eli had been wearing when he left that morning. There was no blood on it, no sign of a struggle in the soil, only that single scrap left fluttering in the breeze. The discovery should have brought relief. Instead, it deepened the mystery. The searchers scoured the ground around the rifle and the bush, hoping for prints, broken branches, or any sign of where Eli had gone. But the forest floor was undisturbed. The earth was firm, the undergrowth untrampled. It was as if Eli had simply dissolved into the air. As the men argued over what it meant, a strange unease crept over them. The dogs that had been brought along began to whine and paw at the ground, circling restlessly. One hound suddenly refused to go further, planting its legs firmly in the soil and letting out a low growl that sent chills down the men's spines. These were dogs bred for hunting, fearless and determined. Their sudden fear was worse than silence. William clutched the rifle tightly, his jaw set. "My boy did not run from this," he said quietly. "Something happened here, but it leaves no mark." His words carried more dread than certainty, and the men exchanged uneasy glances. They had no argument against him, but neither did they have an explanation. When they returned to town that evening, the findings were shared with the waiting families. Relief turned quickly to rumor. Some said a wild animal had dragged Eli away, though no blood was found. Others whispered of men who robbed and murdered travelers in the woods, even though nothing of Eli's was missing except himself. A few, older voices murmured of darker things, of spirits bound to the forest, who lured the living and left only scraps behind. The discovery of the rifle and the torn shirt should have been a step toward answers. Instead, it was the beginning of a silence that only grew louder. For the Johnson family, it marked the moment hope began to fade, replaced by a gnawing fear that Eli had crossed a threshold no man was meant to cross. A threshold guarded by the forest itself. The discovery of Eli's rifle and the strip of torn flannel should have brought closure, but it did the opposite. It was as if the forest itself had played a cruel trick, offering just enough to remind everyone that Eli had been there, but not enough to explain why he was gone. In the days that followed, fear spread like wildfire through Newton County. Families whispered behind closed doors. Children were forbidden to step beyond the edges of their farms. Men who once roamed the woods freely now refused to travel without company, their rifles clutched tighter than before. At church gatherings, the prayers grew longer, voices trembling as if trying to ward off something that lurked just beyond the walls. Theories multiplied. Some insisted Eli had been taken by a wild cat. Panthers had been sighted in the Ozarks before, and they were known to strike without warning. But even the old hunters shook their heads at that idea. A panther would have left blood, tracks, or worse. It would not have neatly abandoned a rifle against a tree. Others whispered of outlaws. The backwoods were known to harbor drifters and bandits who preyed on travelers. But if Eli had been attacked by men, where was his body? Where were the signs of a struggle? None of it added up. The strangest stories came from the oldest residents, those who had lived in the shadow of the Ozark Mountains their entire lives. They spoke in hushed tones of things older than memory. Spirits bound to the land, angry and restless, waiting for those foolish enough to cross their paths. These elders claimed that Eli had not been killed or kidnapped. They said the forest had taken him. Abigail Moore, a woman well into her 70s, was one of the first to speak openly about it. Sitting on her porch one evening, she told neighbors that she had heard it before. The cries in the distance that were not animal and not human. The flicker of pale light between the trees when no lantern was there. She warned them not to dismiss the signs. "The forest knows who walks beneath its branches," she said, her eyes clouded with age. "And sometimes it does not let them leave." Her words unsettled even the bravest men. They dismissed her in public, laughed nervously at her warnings, but behind closed doors her voice lingered in their minds. Each time the wind howled through the valleys, each time a shadow shifted at the tree line, they thought of her words. As November crept closer, the unease hardened into something darker. Livestock began to disappear from farms. Chickens vanished overnight, goats taken from their pens without a trace of blood or tracks. Horses were found in their stalls, with their throats torn open, their bodies stiff by mourning. Families whispered that it was connected, that whatever had taken Eli was not done. At night, strange sounds echoed across the ridges. Some described them as low moans, others as shrill cries that rose and fell until dogs howled in terror. Men who sat awake with rifles across their knees swore the noises circled their homes, never too close, but never far enough away to ignore. In town, the preacher urged the community to stay strong, to put faith above fear, but the pews grew thinner with each passing week, as families chose to stay home rather than risk walking through the dark roads to church. The sense of safety that once bound the community together was unraveling. By the end of the month, the Johnson family was no longer the only one keeping lanterns burning through the night. Entire households stayed awake, listening for the sounds from the woods. Some men spoke of leaving the valley altogether, abandoning their land rather than testing the forest's patience any further. The rifle and the torn flannel had been the first warnings. Now, the community was beginning to understand. Whatever lived in the Ozark woods had noticed them, and it was not finished. By the time November settled over the Ozarks in 1908, fear had already seeped into every corner of Newton County, but nothing prepared the community for what happened next. Eli Johnson's disappearance might have been written off as an isolated tragedy, a cruel twist of fate, until another man vanished, without warning and without reason. His name was Samuel Briggs. A trapper by trade, he lived in a small cabin at the edge of the forest, a rugged man known for his independence and skill. Samuel had hunted these woods for more than 20 years. He knew where the streams crossed, where the game trails ran, and where to set his traps for foxes and mink. If anyone understood the Ozark wilderness, it was him. On the morning of November 10th, smoke was seen curling from the chimney of Samuel's cabin. Neighbors passing along the ridge later recalled hearing his dogs barking, sharp and restless, as if something had unsettled them. But by nightfall, when a friend stopped by to check on him, Samuel was gone. The cabin door was wide open. Inside, a pot of stew still simmered over the fire. Bread sat cooling on the table, half sliced as though Samuel had been preparing his supper. His rifle leaned against the wall, fully loaded. His traps, usually emptied and reset before dusk, were untouched. Only the dogs remained, pacing in circles and whining at the tree line as though they sensed something lurking just beyond sight. Searchers returned to the woods, this time with urgency sharpened by dread. They combed through ravines and hollows, calling Samuel's name as they had done for Eli only weeks before. Once again, they found nothing. No tracks, no signs of a struggle, no body. Just silence so heavy it felt alive. Rumors spread faster than wildfire. If Eli had been young and inexperienced, some could explain his disappearance as misfortune, but Samuel was seasoned. He had survived storms, panthers, and the brutal winters of the mountains. For him to vanish, leaving behind food, weapons, and shelter, defied all logic. It was not just the absence that unsettled the men. It was the details, the stew bubbling on the hearth, left as though Samuel had been plucked from existence in the middle of his meal. The bread knife still pressed into the loaf, the dogs growling at the woods, their fur bristling in terror. These were not the signs of a man who chose to leave, nor of one killed by natural predator. This was something else. Whispers grew bolder now. Some claimed the forest itself had taken Samuel, just as it had taken Eli. Others said a presence walked between the trees, watching, waiting, choosing who would be next. Children were warned never to look too long at the woods after sundown. Lanterns burned longer into the night, and the sound of distant cries became harder to dismiss. The second disappearance shattered any illusion of safety. People no longer dared to dismiss Abigail Moore's warnings of spirits in the hills. Even men who had once laughed at superstition began muttering prayers under their breath when they passed the tree line. Women clutched their children closer, and entire families spoke openly of packing up and leaving the valley. For William Johnson, Eli's father, Samuel's disappearance cut like a knife. It was proof that his son's fate had not been an accident. Something was out there, something intelligent enough to strike again, bold enough to do it in plain sight, and merciless enough to leave no trace. The Ozark woods were no longer just a place of beauty or danger. They had become a predator in their own right, and now everyone in Newton County felt its eyes on them. By December of 1908, the people of Newton County were living in a constant state of unease. Eli Johnson was gone. Samuel Briggs had vanished. But it was the livestock killings that would turn fear into terror, proving to the community that whatever haunted the Ozark woods was growing bolder, hungrier, and closer to home. It began quietly. A farmer woke one frosted morning to find that every chicken in his coop had vanished. The wooden latch was still closed, the snow around the coop unmarked by prints, and yet the birds were gone as though lifted into the night sky. He swore he heard nothing. No flapping wings, no cries of alarm, only silence. Days later, a goat was found dead in a nearby pasture. Its body had been drained of blood, but no wound large enough to explain how. The snow beneath it was clean, untouched by predator tracks, as if the animal had simply collapsed where it stood. Whispers spread quickly. By Christmas, the whispers had turned into cries of dread. Horses, prized possessions of these mountain families, were next. Several were discovered lying in their stalls at dawn, their throats torn open with a violence no one could explain. The wooden beams of the stables bore deep gouges, as though something with claws had raked them in a frenzy. But again, there were no tracks in the snow, no sign of intruders, just the bodies, stiff and cold, their wide eyes frozen in terror. Neighbors gathered at the scenes, staring with disbelief. Seasoned hunters swore that no animal native to the Ozarks could have done this. Panthers killed cleanly, dragging their prey into the trees. Bears left tracks, scat, and torn earth. But this left nothing, only death. The killings did not stop. They escalated. Sheep vanished overnight from pens locked with iron latches. Pigs were discovered, mutilated, their carcasses left half-eaten as if whatever took them lost interest midway through the feast. Families began keeping lanterns burning through the night, rifles loaded and leaning against door frames. Yet even in the glow of firelight, no one felt safe. The sounds came next. Farmers lying awake in their cabins swore they heard noises drifting across the fields, low growls that rose into shrill, piercing cries. The sounds circled the homesteads, sometimes close enough that dogs barked furiously, sometimes far off in the ridges, echoing into the valleys. The noises never came at the same hour, but they always came at night. Dogs that had once guarded farms faithfully began refusing to leave porches. Some cowered in corners, trembling, refusing food as though something unseen had broken their spirit. One family found their hound dead by morning, its body twisted as though it had died of sheer fright. Fear spread deeper than ever. Families who had lived in these hills for generations, bound by blood and land, began speaking of leaving. They whispered of curses, of spirits, of something not born of this world. Abigail Moore's warnings, once dismissed as the ramblings of an old woman, now sounded like prophecy. The forest is awake, she told anyone who would listen, and it is feeding. The killings left more than empty barns and broken families. They left a sense of something intelligent at work. Whatever prowled the Ozarks was not killing for survival alone. It was killing to terrify, to remind the people of Newton County that the woods belonged to it, not them. By the end of the year, the Ozark woods were no longer just feared. They were hated, cursed as a place where life itself could be stolen without reason. The disappearances of Eli and Samuel had unsettled the community, but the livestock killings made it clear. Something monstrous was moving closer, and it was only a matter of time before it struck again. By January of 1909, Newton County was no longer the same community it had been only months before. Families that once slept peacefully now lay awake, rifles across their laps, lanterns burning low into the night. Every creak of the cabin walls, every howl of the wind against the trees made hearts pound faster. The woods were no longer trusted, not even by those who had spent their lives walking its trails. It was during this uneasy winter that Thomas Hargrove returned from the forest with a story so horrifying that even the most hardened men struggled to dismiss it. Thomas was no stranger to the mountains. A hunter in his 40s, he had lived off the land since boyhood. He was a man who scoffed at superstition, who believed in skill, patience, and bullets, not ghosts or curses. But when he staggered into the tavern one night, pale and trembling, no one doubted that something had shaken him to his core. He sat at the table, hands still trembling around a cup of whiskey, and told the men what he had seen. That afternoon, he had set out to hunt along the northern ridges. The snow was thin, the ground crisp beneath his boots, and the forest eerily still. Hours passed without so much as the sight of a deer or rabbit. He remembered thinking it was too quiet, as if the animals themselves had fled. As dusk began to fall, Thomas heard it, a sound unlike anything he had ever known. It began as a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the trees, then rose into a high-pitched shriek that made the hair stand on his neck. He turned, rifle ready, but there was nothing, only shadows stretching between the trunks. Then he saw the eyes, two glowing orbs staring back at him from between the trees. They were not the yellow of a panther or the red of a fox caught in lantern light. These were pale, almost white, and they did not blink. They hovered higher than a man's head, motionless, unblinking, watching him. Thomas raised his rifle, his hands shaking. But before he could fire, the smell hit him, a stench of rot and damp earth, so strong it made his stomach twist. He swore later that it was the smell of graves, of something long dead walking where it should not. The thing stepped forward. For the briefest moment, Thomas saw its shape. It walked upright, but its limbs were too long, its shoulders hunched in a way that no man's ever could be. He did not describe a face, only the eyes, glowing white in the darkness. Then it vanished, slipping back into the trees without a sound. Thomas ran. He dropped his pack, tore through the undergrowth, and did not stop until the lights of town flickered in the distance. He swore that something followed him, just out of sight, all the way down the ridge. When he finished his tale, silence filled the tavern. No one laughed. No one dismissed it as drink or imagination, because Thomas Hargrove was not a man who frightened easily, and that night he had been terrified. Word spread quickly. Some dismissed it publicly, claiming he had seen nothing but shadows and heard nothing but the wind. But behind closed doors, men admitted what they feared most. If Thomas had seen it, then Eli and Samuel had too, and neither of them had lived to tell the tale. After that night, Thomas never returned to the forest. He abandoned his traps, sold his hunting dogs, and lived the rest of his days as a farmer on the edge of town. Whenever asked about the eyes, he would only say one thing: it was watching me, and it wanted me to know it. By February of 1909, fear was no longer confined to the families of Eli Johnson and Samuel Briggs. It had spread like a sickness through every farm, every cabin, and every church pew in Newton County. The disappearances and livestock killings had already pushed the community to its limits, but what came next broke whatever fragile sense of safety still remained. It began with the noises. At first, people dismissed them as wolves, coyotes, or even owls calling in the night. But the sounds grew stranger, louder, and harder to explain. Farmers lying awake in their cabins swore they heard low, guttural moans rising from the tree line, echoing across the frozen field. These moans would swell, twisting into high-pitched wails that rattled window panes and made the lantern glass tremble. Dogs barked furiously at the darkness, then cowered, whining as though they knew something larger and more powerful was lurking just beyond the glow of the lanterns. Chickens squawked and thrashed in their coops until feathers scattered across the floor. Horses kicked wildly in their stalls, eyes rolling white with terror. The strangest part was the pattern. The sounds never came from the same direction twice. One night, they echoed from the ridges to the east, the next from the valley to the west, then from the dense timber straight behind the cabins. Always shifting, always circling. It was as if something was testing the community, moving closer, listening, learning. Families began to sit awake together, too frightened to sleep. Mothers clutched children against their chests as fathers sat at windows, rifles across their knees, watching the dark. Conversations were carried out in whispers, as if speaking too loudly might draw the sounds closer. One night, a family reported hearing the noises just outside their door. The father swore that as the moans rose into shrieks, the wooden boards of the porch creaked beneath unseen weight. He opened the door with his rifle ready, but nothing was there. Only the lingering stench of rot drifting through the cold air. Another family claimed they saw flickering lights weaving between the trees, like lanterns carried by invisible hands. The lights moved in silence, weaving in and out of the tree trunks until they vanished altogether. By morning, their livestock pen was empty. The preacher tried to hold his congregation together, urging them to trust in faith. But the church grew emptier each Sunday. People were too afraid to walk the roads at night. Some stopped attending altogether, praying instead behind locked doors while the sounds wailed outside. Whispers of superstition became louder. Some claimed the cries were the voices of the missing, Eli and Samuel calling out from the woods. Others insisted they were warnings, an ancient curse echoing through the valleys. And still others believed they were hunting calls, the cries of something unnatural that prowled the ridges under the cover of darkness. The fear reached its peak one bitter night when half the town heard the same sound at once. A scream, sharper than any before, tore through the valley. It began low and human-like, then climbed higher and higher until it no longer resembled anything living. Windows shook, doors rattled, cattle broke through fences in a frenzy of panic. That night, no one slept. Lanterns burned in every window. Rifles gleamed in every hand. Children wept silently in their beds, too afraid to ask what the grown-ups already knew. Something was out there. Something that was no longer content to linger in the shadows. By dawn, the valley was silent again. But the people of Newton County were changed. They no longer doubted. The sounds were not just animals, not tricks of the wind. They were a message, and the message was clear. The forest was alive, it was watching, and it was moving closer. The winter of 1909 was harsh. Snow blanketed the Ozark ridges in thick, unforgiving layers, muffling every sound and covering every path. Families huddled in their cabins, fires crackling low, praying the storms would pass quickly. But on one frigid February morning, a group of farmers made a discovery that shattered whatever fragile peace remained. It began when Jacob Miller, a young farmer, set out before dawn to check his cattle. He carried a lantern in one hand, his boots crunching in the snow, breath curling like smoke in the icy air. Halfway across the pasture, he froze. There, trailing out of the woods, was a line of crimson drops stark against the white ground. Blood. Jacob called for his brothers, and together they followed the trail. It wound across the field, dipping into a shallow ravine before snaking deeper into the forest. The drops grew thicker as they went, spattering across rocks and branches, until the snow looked as though it had been painted with violence. The men expected to find a body, perhaps a deer dragged from its herd, or worse, another missing neighbor. They braced themselves for the discovery, lantern light flickering against the trees. But as the trail continued, unease grew. There were no hoofprints, no paw marks, no boot tracks, just blood, as if it had fallen from the sky. After nearly half a mile, the trail ended. Abruptly. One moment the crimson drops stained the snow, the next the ground was clean and untouched, a flawless blanket of white stretching in every direction. The brothers spread out, searching desperately for more signs. There were none. It was as though the source of the blood had simply vanished. Then they saw the tree. It stood taller than the rest, its bark scarred with deep gouges that clawed upward nearly 12 feet from the ground. The cuts were raw and fresh, splinters still hanging loose. No animal native to the Ozarks could have reached that height. Not a panther, not a bear, nothing. The gouges were unnatural, jagged as though carved by hands too large and too cruel to belong to a man. The farmers retreated in silence, their lanterns swaying as they stumbled back through the snow. When they returned to town, their voices shook as they described what they had seen. Some called them liars, saying fear had twisted their eyes. Others believed every word, for in their own hearts they knew the forest was not empty. That night, no one slept. Families gathered in single rooms, children pressed against their parents as men loaded rifles, and women whispered prayers. The fire burned low, shadows dancing against the walls, as outside the wind carried faint cries across the valley. The discovery of the blood on the snow marked a turning point. Until then, the disappearances and killings had left room for doubt. People could tell themselves it was panthers, outlaws, or misfortune. But the gouged tree and the trail that ended in nothing tore those illusions apart. Something unnatural walked the Ozarks, something that bled, that clawed, that hunted, and perhaps most terrifying of all, it wanted to be found. By the time spring crept cautiously into the Ozarks in 1909, the fear that gripped Newton County had changed shape. The blood on the snow had convinced many that something monstrous stalked the woods. But as the thaw melted the drifts and the hills breathed again, the terror became stranger, more haunting. It began with sightings. A traveler moving along a ridge at dusk claimed he saw a woman standing in the trees below. She was dressed in white, her hair long and unkempt, her pale face turned toward him. He called out, but she gave no answer. Instead, she raised one arm, as though beckoning him closer. He started down the slope, stumbling through brush, but when he reached the spot where she had stood, the clearing was empty. He told his story in town, his voice low and unsteady. Some laughed, claiming the fading light had played tricks on his eyes. But within days, others reported the same. A farmer's wife swore she saw the woman standing at the edge of her pasture, her dress glowing faintly in the moonlight. 2 hunters swore they watched her drifting between trees for nearly half a mile, always ahead of them, always out of reach. A group of children claimed they saw her near the creek, her reflection shimmering in the water even as her body vanished from sight. The details varied, but certain things never changed. She was always dressed in white, she never spoke, and she never left footprints. As the stories spread, the people of Newton County began to wonder if the disappearances were not the work of beasts at all, but of spirits. Abigail Moore, the elder who had long warned of the forest's wrath, declared that the woman was no lost soul but a lure. She calls them, Abigail said, and when they follow, the woods keep them. Her warning gained weight when a young traveler named Henry Collins went missing in April. His friends said he had left their campfire to relieve himself and never returned. When they searched, they found only his hat lying in the grass and the faint outline of a woman's figure pressed into the soil nearby, though no footprints led away. Henry's disappearance reignited old fears. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers forbade their sons from leaving sight of the homestead. At night, families swore they heard faint laughter drifting through the trees, high and lilting, as though a woman were singing far away. But the melody carried no warmth, only cold dread. Men debated whether the woman was a ghost, the spirit of someone wronged long ago, or something far older, wearing a human shape. Whatever she was, those who saw her described the same feeling, the urge to follow. Even hardened men admitted they felt a strange pull, as if their own will were bending toward her. One man confessed in whispers that he had taken a step forward before regaining control, his heart pounding with terror at what might have happened if he had gone further. The woman in white became legend within weeks. Parents warned their children never to chase strange figures in the woods. Travelers avoided the ridges after sundown, yet sightings continued, and with each, the line between folklore and reality blurred further. The monstrous claws in the bark, the blood on the snow, and the glowing eyes in the darkness had revealed one kind of horror. The woman in white revealed another. That terror could wear a human face, that something could beckon you with beauty and leave you lost forever. And still, the disappearances were not over. April of 1909 brought no peace to Newton County. The trees were budding, streams rushed full from the thaw, and the hills seemed alive again. But for the families who had endured months of disappearances, mutilations, and ghostly sightings, spring offered no relief. It would bring only the most devastating blow of all. The Price family lived on a small farm near the edge of the woods. John Price was a hard-working man who cut timber for a living, and his wife, Margaret, tended the household with quiet strength. Their son, Matthew, was 12 years old, bright, curious, and endlessly eager to follow his father on daily chores. By all accounts, Matthew was careful in the woods. He had been raised on stories of Eli Johnson and Samuel Briggs, and his parents had drilled the warnings into him. Stay close. Keep your eyes open. Never wander. On the morning of April 12th, John and Matthew walked together into the forest to gather firewood. John carried an axe. Matthew carried a bundle of twine to tie kindling. They did not travel far, no more than a quarter mile from their cabin. John remembered speaking to his boy about the size of the oak trees, about which would cut cleanest for firewood. He remembered hearing Matthew's footsteps just behind him. And then, silence. When John turned, Matthew was gone. At first, he thought his son had stopped to pick something from the ground. He called out, no answer. He searched the trees nearby, axe in hand, shouting Matthew's name louder with each breath. Panic rose in his chest as he scoured the clearing, his shouts echoing through the valley. But there were no footsteps leading away, no sound of running, no cry for help. It was as if the boy had been plucked from the earth in an instant. John tore through the undergrowth, his hands bleeding from brambles, his voice breaking until it was raw. He ran back to the cabin, screaming for Margaret, and within an hour, neighbors gathered with lanterns and rifles. A search began, larger and more desperate than any before. Dozens of men combed the woods. They spread wider than they had for Eli, searched deeper than they had for Samuel. They called, they fired rifles into the air, they lit bonfires to drive away the darkness. But they found nothing. Not a shred of Matthew's clothing, not a single footprint. Only silence pressing heavy against their ears, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. The community broke under the weight of his loss. A grown man disappearing was a tragedy. A seasoned trapper vanishing was a warning. But a child taken without a trace was something else entirely. It was unforgivable. It was terror made real in its cruelest form. Some said they saw faint flickers of white between the trees during the search, as though the woman in white watched from the shadows. Others swore they heard a child's laughter carried on the wind, twisted and wrong, rising into a shriek before fading into silence. Whether hallucination or haunting, it deepened the horror. After days of relentless searching, the Price family was forced to accept the unthinkable. Matthew was gone, taken like the others, swallowed by the Ozark woods that had already claimed too many. The valley changed that day. Doors that had once stood unlocked were barred and nailed shut. Families stopped working their fields alone. Children were kept under constant watch, forbidden even to step onto porches after sundown. The final disappearance marked the end of innocence for Newton County. It was no longer a matter of fear or superstition. It was fact. Something in the Ozarks was choosing victims, and not even children were spared. The forest had taken its last and most heartbreaking prize, and after that, no one ever looked at the trees the same way again. After the disappearance of young Matthew Price in April of 1909, Newton County was changed forever. The search for him was longer, louder, and more desperate than anything that had come before. And when it failed, the community did not rise again. It collapsed inward, leaving only silence. The woods that had once been a source of life became a presence of dread. Men who once hunted deer with ease now refused to enter the tree line. Children who had once played freely in the fields were kept inside, their laughter muffled by shuttered windows. The rhythm of daily life slowed, replaced by a quiet tension that pressed against every home. Farms were abandoned. Some families packed their wagons and left, refusing to spend another night in a valley that had swallowed neighbors, friends, and a child without leaving a trace. Others stayed, but they lived like prisoners in their own cabins. Lanterns burned through the nights, doors were barred, rifles laid out on tables, and prayers whispered endlessly into the darkness. The woods themselves seemed to change. People swore the silence grew heavier, as if even the birds and insects had fled. The usual songs of spring, the calls of whippoorwills and the buzz of cicadas, were absent. The forest was alive, but it did not speak. And that silence gnawed at the nerves of everyone who remained. No one dared travel alone anymore. When men went to chop wood, they went in groups, axes in hand, eyes darting toward every rustle in the brush. Women carried knives even to the well. Children were kept within arm's reach, and even then, mothers flinched each time a shadow passed across the yard. It was not only the woods that felt cursed. The community itself fractured. Neighbors no longer trusted one another. Some whispered that whatever haunted the forest had helpers among them, men who lured victims into the trees. Others believed the land itself was cursed because of blood spilled in forgotten times, ancient wars, unmarked graves, sins that had soaked into the soil. The preacher's sermons grew more desperate, but fewer people came to listen. The church bell rang over an empty valley, its echoes mocking the emptiness of the pews. Families prayed in silence instead, huddled close together, as though their words might be stolen if spoken too loudly. Even the dogs, once protectors, grew strange. They no longer barked warnings. Many sat silent by doors, ears pressed flat, as though they too were listening to something just beyond the walls. Some refused to eat. A few simply wandered into the woods and never returned, leaving behind only paw prints that ended like Eli Johnson's tracks had months before, suddenly and without explanation. The silence was not peace. It was suffocating, heavy, alive. It pressed against the ears until people swore they could hear their own heartbeats too loudly. It crept into the nights until families woke in cold sweats, certain they had heard a whisper just beyond the cabin walls. Weeks turned into months. The spring flowers bloomed and faded, and the valley remained trapped in fear. The disappearances had stopped, but no one dared to believe the nightmare was over. Instead, they felt watched, chosen, as if the forest was satisfied for now, but waiting for its hunger to return. By summer, Newton County was no longer the lively community it had once been. It was a shadow of itself, hollowed out by fear, wrapped in silence. The people who stayed lived in constant anticipation of the next cry, the next flicker of light, the next vanishing. And in that suffocating quiet, the Ozark woods loomed larger than ever, dark and endless, guarding the secrets of what it had taken. The silence was worse than the screams. because silence could last forever. More than 100 years have passed since the year 1908, but the shadow of those months has never truly lifted from the Ozarks. The names of Eli Johnson, Samuel Briggs, and Matthew Price are still whispered in Newton County, not as history lessons, but as warnings. Parents who never knew them still tell their children the same words that echoed through the valley a century ago. Never go alone into the woods. The forest itself has not changed. The ridges still rise like black walls against the sky. The trees still weave their branches into a canopy that blocks the sunday. The creeks still wind their way through hollows where light rarely touches. But for those who live nearby, the woods are no longer only a landscape. They are a presence. Hikers in modern times have reported strange cries at night, sounds that do not match any known animal. Some claim they have seen figures between the trees, pale and fleeting, vanishing the moment they are approached. Hunters whisper of shadows that move without sound, keeping pace just beyond sight, as if following them home. A few swear they have glimpsed a woman in white at dusk, her shape glowing faintly before dissolving into the gathering dark. Skeptics dismiss these tales as folklore, exaggerations passed down from frightened ancestors. But for those who live in the Ozarks, the line between myth and truth has always been thin. Too many vanishings remain unsolved. Too many voices have trembled as they spoke of eyes glowing in the night. Too many stories align across generations for the fear to be dismissed entirely. The silence that followed the final disappearance never truly ended. It echoes in every locked door, every lantern lit through the night, every child warned not to step too close to the tree line. The legacy of fear is not written in books. It is written in the way the people live, in the way the forest is still regarded not as a place of beauty, but as a place of hunger. The Ozark woods do not forget, and the people who live in their shadow do not forget either. Whether it is spirit, beast, or something older than memory, the truth is that the forest took what it wanted in 1908, and it may still be waiting for its next victim. The story of the Ozark vanishings is more than a piece of dark history. It is a reminder that some places hold secrets too deep to uncover and too dangerous to ignore. The forest is not only a setting, it is a character, alive, patient, and watchful. If this story has unsettled you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the horrifying accounts that history tried to bury. Share this video with someone who believes legends are only fairy tales, and let them decide if they would dare to step alone into the Ozark woods. Because more than a century later, the trees still stand, the silence still lingers, and the fear still waits.